There are roughly 500 active K-pop idol groups in the world right now. Within that landscape, standing out is genuinely difficult, and standing out within your own group is even harder. But somehow, one member of Stray Kids has managed to do exactly that. And not by chasing attention. It happened almost naturally, through a combination of things he was born with, choices he made, and a life story that reads nothing like his bandmates. He grew up on the other side of the world. He walks into a room looking one way and opens his mouth sounding completely different. He bakes, he hugs people, and underneath all of that warmth is a voice that has stopped entire concert arenas cold. His name is Lee Felix, and the more you look at the details of who he actually is, not the stage version, not the highlight reel, the more you realize he's genuinely one of a kind, even among 8 people who are already exceptional. So what exactly makes Felix Felix? Here are 7 facts that answer that question, and the first one alone will change how you listen to Stray Kids. Number 7. An instantly recognizable deep voice. There's a moment in Stray Kids' 2019 track Miro that catches first-time listeners off guard almost every single time. The instrumental drops into a lower register, the energy shifts, and then a voice enters that doesn't sound like it belongs to a 19-year-old. It's dense, unhurried, and carries a weight that sits somewhere between a seasoned rap veteran and a film narrator. That voice belongs to Felix, and for a lot of people, that was the first time they truly noticed him. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how voice distribution works in K-pop. In most groups, the sound architecture is relatively predictable. Main vocalists carry the melody, rappers deliver verses in the mid to upper range, and the overall sonic palette stays within a fairly consistent band. Stray Kids already breaks this mold. Their production style, driven largely by their in-house unit 3 Racha, tends to be heavier and more layered than industry standard. But even within that sound, Felix's voice occupies a register that almost no other K-pop idol is working in. To put this in measurable terms, the average male speaking voice sits between 85 and 180 hertz. Bass singers, considered rare in any musical tradition, typically operate comfortably below 100 hertz. Felix's voice, particularly in performance and recording settings, consistently occupies the lower end of that range. Music producers and audio engineers have publicly noted this in fan-translated interviews and behind-the-scenes content. His voice requires specific mic sensitivity adjustments because it carries so much low-frequency energy. That's not a stylistic observation, that's a technical one. What makes this even more unusual is the context. Felix was born in 2000. He joined JYP Entertainment as a trainee at 15 after being scouted at a school audition in Australia. At the time, he had almost no Korean language ability and 0 formal performance training. His voice at that stage was already noticeably low for his age, something his fellow trainees and later his label mates have commented on in various reality show segments and interviews over the years. It wasn't developed through deliberate vocal training to achieve a lower sound. It's simply what his voice is. In Stray Kids' discography, Felix's voice is used with precision. He rarely carries a full verse the way a main rapper would. Instead, his lines tend to be concentrated, short, impactful deliveries that land at key moments in a track and shift the entire mood of the song. Listen to God's Menu, Miro, Backdoor, or Thunderous. In each of those tracks, there are specific moments where the production almost clears space for his voice to land properly. That kind of arrangement isn't accidental. Producers know what they have, and they use it accordingly. The contrast effect is significant from a music theory standpoint. When a very deep voice enters immediately after or alongside higher-pitched voices, which is the case in almost every Stray Kids track, the human ear perceives it as a strong point of contrast, which naturally draws attention. It functions almost like a key change. The brain registers it as something different, something that breaks the established pattern. This is one of the core reasons why even in tracks where Felix has a relatively small number of lines, he tends to be one of the most commented on members after a song's release. There's also a perceptual dimension to this that goes beyond pure sound. Research in voice perception, including studies from the University of Aberdeen and various cognitive psychology journals, consistently shows that deeper male voices are perceived as more authoritative and commanding, even when the content of what's being said is identical to someone with a higher voice. Felix's stage presence amplifies this. He performs with intensity and physical precision, but it's the voice that seals it. The combination of high-energy choreography and that low vocal register creates a sensory contrast that's genuinely hard to forget. Among K-pop fandoms, the reaction to Felix's voice has become something of a recurring cultural moment. Videos of fans, particularly international fans, hearing Stray Kids for the first time, reacting to the moment his voice enters a track, have accumulated millions of views across YouTube and TikTok. The reaction is almost the same: visible surprise, then immediate curiosity. Who is that? That response is not engineered, it's just what happens when something genuinely unexpected lands. Felix himself has spoken about his voice in interviews with a level of awareness that's refreshingly straightforward. In a 2020 V Live segment, he acknowledged that his voice surprises people who meet him in person, noting the gap between his appearance and the sound that comes out when he speaks or performs. He didn't frame it as a superpower or a brand. He talked about it the way someone would talk about being unusually tall. It's just part of how he's built. What's worth sitting with, though, is that this voice, something Felix didn't choose and didn't train for, became one of the defining sonic signatures of one of the biggest K-pop groups in the world. Stray Kids' sound is dark, layered, and unconventional by industry standards. Felix's voice didn't just fit into that sound, it helped define it. Remove those deep register moments from their discography, and the tracks feel measurably lighter, not worse necessarily, but different in a way that matters. In a genre built heavily on visual identity, it's rare for a voice alone to function as a fingerprint. Felix's does. You don't need a credits list, you don't need a caption. When that voice enters a room, on a speaker, through earbuds, across a stadium, you know exactly whose it is. And it turns out that voice is only one piece of what makes him different, because Felix didn't just grow up sounding like anyone else in his group. He grew up in an entirely different country. Number 6. Born and raised in Australia. In 2018, JYP Entertainment launched a survival reality show called Stray Kids, designed to select the final lineup of what would become one of the company's flagship groups. 9 contestants, weeks of brutal eliminations, and one overriding question: who has what it takes? Among those 9 was a teenager who, just a few years earlier, had been living in Sydney, attending a regular Australian school, and had never once seriously considered a career in the Korean entertainment industry. His name was Lee Young-bok, known to the world now as Felix, and his path to that show floor began roughly 8,400 kilometers from Seoul. Felix was born on September 15, 2000, in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. He grew up there in a Korean-Australian household, raised by parents who maintained strong ties to Korean culture while building their life in one of Australia's largest cities. This matters more than it might seem at first glance. Felix didn't grow up in the Korean entertainment ecosystem. He didn't have access to the dense network of idol academies, industry connections, and cultural context that trainees who grow up in Seoul tend to absorb simply by proximity. His understanding of performance, music, and what it meant to be an idol came filtered through a completely different cultural framework, one shaped by Australian schools, Australian friends, and a daily life that had very little to do with K-pop infrastructure. He was discovered in 2017 at a JYP Entertainment audition in Sydney, one of the company's international scouting events designed specifically to find talent outside Korea. According to accounts from Felix himself in various interviews, he attended on something close to a whim. He had done some dancing, enjoyed performing, but had no serious plan to pursue it professionally. He was scouted on the spot. Within a relatively short window, he was on a plane to Seoul to begin training at one of the most competitive entertainment companies in South Korea. To appreciate how significant that shift was, consider what it actually means to relocate from Sydney to Seoul as a 16-year-old with limited Korean language ability, no existing industry relationships, and no real context for what a K-pop trainee's daily life looks like. Sydney is a city of roughly 5.3 million people. It's multicultural, English-dominant, and operates at a pace and cultural rhythm that is genuinely different from Seoul, a city of nearly 10 million, where the entertainment industry is deeply embedded in national culture, and where trainee life involves schedules that routinely run 12 to 16 hours a day. The adjustment required of Felix was not just logistical, it was psychological and cultural on a level that most people his age would find overwhelming. Among the 8 members of Stray Kids, Felix stands alone in this regard. Bang Chan, the group's leader, was also raised in Australia, in Sydney, in fact, making him and Felix the only two who share that specific background. But even within that shared geography, their paths were different. Bang Chan moved to Korea earlier and had more time to assimilate into the training environment before the group formed. Felix came in later and had to compress that adjustment into a much shorter timeline, while simultaneously learning the language, learning the choreography, and competing for a spot in a group that wasn't guaranteed to include him. His Australian upbringing gave him something that's harder to quantify but genuinely visible in how he operates. There's a directness to Felix, a warmth that doesn't feel calculated, a way of engaging with people that feels less like industry polish and more like straightforward human openness. Observers who've watched him across years of content, reality shows, fan meetings, behind-the-scenes footage, consistently describe the same thing. He seems unusually comfortable with himself, particularly for someone in an industry where image management is constant and exhausting. That ease has roots. Growing up in a culture that values directness, outdoor life, and a less rigid social hierarchy leaves marks on a person, and those marks are visible in Felix even now. His bilingual background, fluent Korean acquired through family and then formalized through immersion training, and native English level developed through his Australian schooling, also positioned him uniquely within the group's international engagements. When Stray Kids began expanding their global reach, Felix became one of the primary bridges between the group and their non-Korean-speaking fanbase. He could communicate naturally and spontaneously in English without requiring a translator, which in live fan interactions is a meaningful difference. Scripted English is one thing, genuine, unscripted conversation is another. Felix operates comfortably in the latter. There's also a cultural currency to being Australian in a way that's worth acknowledging without overstating it. Australia has a distinct global cultural identity, relaxed, irreverent, warm, with a particular kind of humor that tends to be self-deprecating rather than performative. Felix carries traces of that identity in ways that make him feel different from his bandmates, even in casual group interactions. It's not that he's more or less Korean than the others, it's that he's both things at once, and he moves between them with a fluency that comes from having actually lived both lives. His story also quietly challenges a particular assumption that still exists in some corners of K-pop discussion, that global stars from Korean entertainment are products of a specifically Korean cultural process, shaped from a young age by a single system. Felix is a counterexample to that. He came in from the outside, adapted, competed, and not only made the group, but became one of its most globally recognized faces. That outcome didn't happen in spite of his Australian background. In many ways, it happened because of what that background gave him. And one of those things it gave him, something that has become almost as recognizable as his voice, is an accent that fans around the world have come to associate him instantly. Number 5. His English accent is a trademark. There's a particular clip that resurfaces on Kpop social media with reliable regularity. Felix is speaking English, casually, off the cuff, not for a rehearsed segment, and the comment sections fill up almost immediately with variations of the same observation: that accent. It doesn't sound like the careful, textbook English that many K-pop idols work hard to develop for international interviews. It doesn't sound American, which is the default most language training in the Korean entertainment industry tends to orient toward. It sounds distinctly, unmistakably Australian. And for millions of fans who encounter it for the first time, that specific quality is part of what makes Felix feel like nobody else in the genre. Language and accent carry more identity information than most people consciously register. Linguistics researchers at institutions including the University of Queensland and the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics have extensively documented how accents function as markers of origin, community, and authenticity, and how listeners instinctively use accent cues to build impressions of a speaker before they've fully processed what's actually being said. What this means in practical terms is that Felix's Australian accent isn't just a pleasant, distinguishing feature. It communicates something real about where he comes from and how he grew up without him having to say a single word about it explicitly. The accent does that work on its own. The Australian English accent has specific phonological characteristics that set it apart from other major English varieties. Vowel sounds are shifted in ways that linguists classify as part of the Southern Hemisphere accent continuum. The vowel in words like face or name sounds closer to face or nime to untrained ears. The intonation pattern tends to be melodic, with a slight upward inflection at the end of declarative sentences, a feature sometimes called high-rising terminal, which is more prevalent in Australian and New Zealand English than in British or American varieties. The rhythm is also distinct. Australian speech tends to flow at a pace that's relaxed but clipped, without the extended vowel drawl associated with certain American regional accents. Felix's English carries all of these features in a form that's been naturally embedded through years of growing up in Sydney, not learned in a classroom, not approximated through media consumption, but absorbed through lived experience. This matters in the context of the K-pop industry because English proficiency among idols exists on a wide spectrum, and the way it's acquired shapes how it sounds in ways that are immediately perceptible. Many K-pop trainees and idols develop functional English through formal study, supplemented by American media. The result is often technically correct but tonally neutral, competent but without the texture that comes from native or near-native immersion. Felix's English carries the full weight of genuine bilingual development. He didn't learn English as a second language, he grew up in it. Korean for him was the language that required deliberate acquisition, and he developed it to a level of fluency that allowed him to compete and succeed in one of the most demanding training environments in the Korean entertainment industry. That's a notable reversal of the standard K-pop language narrative. In fan-documented interactions across live streams, fan meetings, and variety show appearances, Felix's English has consistently been a point of genuine delight for international audiences, particularly those from Australia, the UK, New Zealand, and other English-speaking countries, where his accent registers as familiar and warm. There's a relatability effect that kicks in when someone from your linguistic community appears in a context where you didn't expect to find them. For Australian fans especially, Felix occupies a specific kind of cultural proximity that is both rare in K-pop and genuinely meaningful on a personal level. Comments from Australian fans in various online communities frequently describe the experience of watching Felix as feeling like watching someone from their world succeed in a space that usually feels very far away. Felix himself has shown self-awareness about his accent in multiple interview and content settings, though he tends to discuss it lightly rather than making it a defining talking point. In several fan interaction videos, he's been asked to say specific words or phrases in his natural Australian accent, and his willingness to do so, without performance or exaggeration, reflects a comfort with that part of his identity that feels genuine rather than managed. He's also spoken in various behind-the-scenes segments about the challenge of his early training period, when his Korean was still developing and he had to navigate a highly demanding environment in a language he was still building fluency in. That difficulty gives the accent a different kind of weight when you know the full context. It's not just a charming quirk, it's a remnant of the life he came from, intact after everything he went through to build the life he has now. There's a practical dimension to this that's easy to overlook. When Stray Kids conduct international press tours, English language interviews, or global live events, Felix's ability to communicate naturally and with full linguistic personality, not just with grammatical accuracy, gives those interactions a different quality. The humor lands differently in your first language. The timing is sharper. The warmth feels less filtered. Fans and interviewers who've experienced this firsthand have consistently noted that speaking with Felix in English feels substantively different from the experience of speaking with idols who are working in English as a learned language. That distinction is real, and the accent is part of what creates it. In a genre where image is constructed with extraordinary care, and where even casual moments are often at least partially managed, Felix's accent functions as something that can't be engineered or replicated. It exists because of where he spent his formative years, how he grew up, and who he was before anyone outside of Sydney knew his name. It's one of the few things about him that belongs entirely to his life before K-pop, and it's followed him all the way to arenas on every continent. What else followed him from that life, though, might surprise you, because one of his most beloved traits has nothing to do with performing and everything to do with what he does when the cameras aren't pointed at a stage. Number 4. A huge love for baking. At some point during the years Stray Kids spent building one of the most dedicated fan bases in contemporary K-pop, fans began noticing something that had nothing to do with choreography or vocal technique. In behind-the-scenes content, in live streams, in casual mentions during group conversations, a pattern kept emerging around Felix. He bakes. Not occasionally, not as a one-time variety show segment, but as a genuine, sustained personal interest that he returns to consistently regardless of whether a camera is involved. In an industry where personal hobbies are frequently packaged as content and presented with careful branding, Felix's relationship with baking reads differently. Quieter, more rooted, more like something that belongs to him rather than to his public image. To understand why this particular hobby carries the weight it does, it helps to know something about what life looks like for an active member of a top-tier K-pop group. Stray Kids' schedule at peak activity periods, world tours, album promotions, variety appearances, fan events, leaves extraordinarily little unstructured time. A 2019 investigative report by the Korea Juwon Daily on trainee and idol life documented average daily schedules running between 12 and 18 hours during promotion periods, with consistent sleep deprivation being one of the most commonly cited challenges by idols across multiple companies. In that environment, the activities a person chooses during whatever free time they have tend to be revealing. They're not chosen for optics, they're chosen because they actually help. Felix has, across multiple documented instances, chosen baking. He's mentioned it in V-Live sessions, discussed it in interviews, referenced it in fan Q&A formats, and been seen in content where the results of his baking, cookies, cakes, various pastries, are shared with members or staff. The specificity matters here. He's not described simply as someone who likes food or enjoys cooking in the broad, vague way that sometimes shows up in idol profile data. He has demonstrated actual knowledge of technique, talked about specific types of baked goods he's worked on, and shown the kind of enthusiasm that comes from genuine engagement with a skill rather than surface-level familiarity with it. Baking, as a practice, is worth taking seriously for a moment because it's often underestimated as a technical activity. Unlike general cooking, which allows significant improvisation and adjustment mid-process, baking is fundamentally chemistry. Ratios of flour, fat, sugar, leavening agents, and liquid must be understood and respected because they interact in ways that are not forgiving of guesswork. The Maillard reaction, the chemical process responsible for browning and flavor development in baked goods, requires specific temperature thresholds and timing. Gluten development in doughs depends on hydration levels and mixing technique. In other words, baking done well requires patience, precision, and a willingness to understand why things work rather than just following steps mechanically. The fact that Felix gravitates toward this particular activity says something about how he approaches things when no one is grading him. There's also a cultural dimension worth noting. In Korean idol culture, physical appearance management is a documented and openly discussed reality. Dietary discipline is a standard expectation, and public discussion of food, particularly sweets and baked goods, is common in idol content because it creates relatable, warm engagement with fans. But Felix's connection to baking predates his career, and by his own account, is genuinely something he's drawn to rather than something performed for relatability. Several accounts from members and staff in unscripted moments reference Felix bringing food he's made to share, which is a behavior that occurs in private contexts, not staged ones. The cultural resonance of baking itself is layered. In Australian culture, where Felix grew up, home baking has a strong domestic tradition. Lamingtons, pavlova, Anzac biscuits are all part of a culinary identity that's tied to community and shared celebration. It's possible, even likely, that Felix's interest in baking has roots in his Australian upbringing, in whatever combination of family tradition and cultural environment shaped what felt normal and comforting during his childhood. When he eventually relocated to Seoul and moved into the demanding and often isolating structure of trainee and then idol life, baking may have served a function beyond just the activity itself, a way of maintaining continuity with something familiar from a life that had changed almost completely. What fans consistently respond to when this side of Felix surfaces is the contrast it creates with the version of him that exists on stage. Felix performing is all controlled power, precise, intense, with a physical presence and a voice that dominates space. Felix talking about cookies he made for the other members is something else entirely. Gentle, pleased with himself in a quiet way, generous with what he's made. Both versions are real, neither one is a performance of the other, but together they form a picture of someone who is more layered than any single image of him captures. There's something worth saying about the act of baking specifically for other people, which is a pattern in how Felix engages with it. Baking as a solitary activity is one thing, a meditative, focused exercise in precision. Baking to share is something more intentional. It requires thinking about other people's preferences, putting time and care into something that will be given away rather than kept, and accepting that the product of your effort is consumed and gone. That's a particular kind of generosity. It doesn't make headlines, it doesn't accumulate streams, it just feeds the people around you, quietly. In a career built on spectacle, world tours, high-concept music videos, stadium-scale performances, there's something grounding about the fact that one of Felix's defining personal interests is making something small and edible and handing it to the people he works with. It's the most domestic of all his attributes, and arguably one of the most human. But if you think the contrast between Felix's stage persona and his personal warmth ends at baking, the next point makes that contrast even sharper, because it goes right to the most visually striking thing about him.
Number 3. A gentle face, an incredibly deep voice. There's a concept in perceptual psychology called the expectancy violation effect. The basic idea is that when the human brain builds a prediction based on available information and that prediction turns out to be wrong, the mismatch itself demands attention. The brain doesn't just note the discrepancy and move on, it lingers on it, processes it more deeply, encodes it more durably into memory than information that simply confirmed what was already expected. It's the reason a plot twist stays with you longer than a predictable ending. It's the reason a joke lands harder when the punchline goes somewhere you didn't see coming. And it is, in very precise neurological terms, exactly what happens when people see Felix and then hear him speak. This contrast, his appearance on one side, his voice on the other, has been documented so consistently across so many different audience types, age groups, and cultural contexts that it stopped being anecdotal a long time ago. It's a measurable, repeatable phenomenon. Show someone a photograph of Felix before they've heard him, play his voice, and the response is almost always some version of genuine surprise. Not because either element is inherently unusual on its own, but because the combination violates an expectation the brain formed quickly and confidently. And that violation is what makes it stick. Felix's face, in the language of East Asian beauty standards that heavily influence K-pop aesthetics, is frequently described using terms like cute or soft, large eyes, smooth skin, and overall facial geometry that reads as open and approachable rather than sharp or severe. Korean beauty media has covered him extensively in exactly these terms. His freckles, a relatively rare feature among Korean entertainers and one that has received significant attention both within Korean and international fan communities, add to this impression of naturalness and warmth. There's nothing about the visual presentation that prepares you for what comes next. And then he speaks. Or raps. Or delivers a line in a track. And what comes out of him sits at the complete opposite end of the sonic spectrum from what his appearance suggests. The voice is low, resonant, with a physical density to it that you register not just as sound but almost as texture. There's a term used in audio engineering, chest voice, to describe vocal production where the resonance is felt primarily in the chest cavity rather than the head or throat. Felix's natural speaking and performing voice operates substantially in that register. The result is a sound that has weight to it in a way that's immediately perceptible even through speakers or earbuds. What's important to establish here is that this contrast is entirely natural, not the product of deliberate image construction or strategic branding. Felix didn't cultivate a soft aesthetic to maximize the impact of his voice. His voice isn't artificially processed or deepened in performance contexts. Both elements simply exist in the same person simultaneously, each authentic, neither exaggerated for effect. That's actually what makes the combination so durable as a distinguishing feature. Manufactured contrasts eventually feel calculated. Genuine ones never do. In the history of popular music, there are examples of artists whose voices surprised audiences in similar ways, performers whose visual presentation created expectations that their sound then completely reoriented. Joe Williams, the jazz vocalist, was noted by critics for exactly this kind of contrast. Barry White, whose voice became one of the most recognized in 20th century American music, consistently surprised people who encountered his sound without visual context. In the K-pop sphere specifically, this kind of voice appearance contrast is genuinely rare, which is part of why Felix's version of it has generated the cultural traction it has. The genre tends to produce relatively cohesive packages, where the visual and sonic identity of an idol occupy similar aesthetic registers. Felix breaks that pattern clearly enough that it's noticeable even to casual observers. The freckles deserve specific attention because they've become an unexpectedly significant part of this larger story. In South Korea, where the dominant beauty standard has historically favored very even, pale, unfreckled skin, Felix's visible freckles were initially a point of personal concern for him, something he's spoken about with openness in several interview contexts, describing a period where he was self-conscious about them. The response from fans, particularly international fans, was essentially the opposite of what he expected. His freckles became one of his most beloved and discussed features, regularly cited in fan communities as a defining characteristic. They even acquired a nickname within the fandom, chocolate freckles, a term that originated in fan communities and spread widely enough to become a standard reference. What Felix experienced as a potential insecurity became, for the people watching him, one of the most human and endearing things about him. The combination of freckles, gentle facial features, and that voice creates a sensory profile that is, in the most literal sense, one of a kind in the current K-pop landscape. There is no other major idol working right now whose combination of visual and sonic identity creates the same specific effect. This is not a matter of subjective fan preference. It's a matter of how human perception processes contrast. And Felix's particular configuration of contrasts is genuinely unusual enough that it functions as an identity signature in a way that most deliberately constructed idol personas never quite achieve. There's also something worth sitting with about what this contrast suggests about the relationship between appearance and capability, an idea that Felix's very existence gently challenges every time he performs. The assumption that a certain kind of face corresponds to a certain kind of voice, or that a certain kind of voice signals a certain kind of power, is embedded deeply enough in human perception that we form these predictions automatically. Felix is a consistent, living correction to that assumption. He doesn't just subvert the expectation. He makes it impossible to maintain. That quality of quietly contradicting what people think they know turns out to run deeper than just his voice and his face. Because the next fact is about who Felix actually is as a person when the performance ends, and how that reality continues to catch people off guard in exactly the same way. Number 2. A warm and caring personality. There's a distinction that's easy to miss when you spend enough time inside K-pop fan culture, where warmth and affection are so consistently performed that the real thing can start to look exactly like the manufactured version. Idols are trained, sometimes explicitly, always implicitly, in the art of making large numbers of people feel personally cared for. Sustained eye contact during fan meetings, remembered details from previous interactions, spontaneous seeming expressions of love and gratitude, these are skills, and in the Korean entertainment industry they are developed with the same seriousness as dancing and vocal technique. Understanding that context is what makes Felix's particular brand of warmth worth examining carefully, because what the evidence consistently shows is that his doesn't originate from training. It originates from something more baseline than that. The clearest data points come not from fan-facing moments, where the performance dimension always exists, but from how Felix behaves with the people he actually lives and works with. Stray Kids members have referenced Felix's attentiveness in group interview contexts numerous times across years of content. Han Ji-sung, in a 2020 V Live that fans have translated and documented extensively, described Felix as someone who notices when a member seems off and addresses it without being asked. Hyunjin has made similar observations in multiple behind-the-scenes segments, characterizing Felix as someone who initiates physical affection, hugs, arm contact, proximity, in a way that doesn't feel calculated or performed. Bang Chan, in his own long-running V-Live series Chan's Room, has spoken about Felix with a kind of specific fondness that distinguishes him from generic group member praise. What makes these observations meaningful rather than just promotional is their specificity. Generic praise in K-pop content tends toward vague superlatives. What the members say about Felix tends to point at particular behaviors, the noticing, the initiating, the consistency of it regardless of context or mood. That pattern of specific, behavioral description is what separates genuine observation from rehearsed appreciation. Physical affection is worth addressing directly because it functions differently across cultures in ways that matter for understanding Felix. South Korean social culture, particularly in professional and semi-professional contexts, is shaped by a hierarchical framework, sunbae and hubie dynamics, age-based deference systems, formality expectations that govern how people relate to each other depending on status and familiarity. Spontaneous physical affection in group settings, while certainly present in close Korean friend groups, exists within a social grammar that can make it feel more intentional and considered than in cultures where physical greeting and contact are more baseline defaults. Felix's Australian upbringing, where casual physical friendliness is more culturally standard, likely contributes to the ease with which he expresses warmth physically. But the other members, who come from Korean cultural backgrounds, don't seem to experience his expressiveness as unusual or imposing. They receive it, which suggests it communicates genuinely rather than awkwardly. Beyond the immediate group, Felix's relationship with the fandom, Stray Kids' official fanbase, also shows behavioral patterns that are distinct enough to be worth noting. In documented fan meeting interactions, Felix has been consistently described across multiple continents and multiple years of touring as someone who makes individual fans feel genuinely seen during brief interactions rather than processed through an efficient meet and greet system. Fan accounts from events in North America, Europe, and Asia, documented in fan community spaces and occasionally referenced in Korean entertainment media, converge on similar descriptions. That the quality of attention he gives during one-on-one moments feels disproportionately real relative to how brief the interaction actually is. That's not a common experience. Most high-volume fan engagement operates on a throughput logic, and the warmth tends to feel like it. Felix's apparently doesn't. In 2021 and 2022, as Stray Kids navigated the pandemic era with its heavily restricted performance and fan interaction environment, Felix's online presence, particularly through social media and V-Live content, became a notable point of stability for segments of the fandom experiencing the same kind of isolation the rest of the world was dealing with. He spoke to fans with a directness about missing them that, again, didn't read as scripted. There's a particular kind of parasocial communication that is produced for effect and a kind that is simply human, and audiences, particularly audiences who have consumed enough of a person's content to develop calibrated expectations, tend to be able to tell the difference. Felix's fell consistently in the second category. What creates the contrast that makes this specific fact worth its own entry in a list about what makes Felix distinctive is the performance dimension. On stage, Felix commands space. He performs with an aggression of energy that is intentional and controlled. His facial expressions during intense choreography, the way he occupies physical space during power sections of a performance, the voice that hits like a low frequency in a room. None of that is the person his members describe in unscripted moments. None of it resembles the person who bakes for the people around him, who notices when someone is off, who pulls people into hugs and van rides and backstage corridors. Both of those people are real, and they occupy the same body, and the gap between them is significant enough that it creates a genuine complexity. That complexity is actually one of the things that sustains interest over time, in ways that a more cohesive, consistent public persona often can't. Audiences stay curious about people they haven't fully figured out. Felix presents as simultaneously highly visible and genuinely interior, someone whose warmth is fully on the surface while the source of it stays somewhat private. The generosity is obvious. The depth behind it is something you keep trying to understand. In a group where every member is compelling, that interior quality is part of what keeps Felix at the center of so much sustained attention. But it's also worth remembering that none of these qualities, the voice, the Australian roots, the accent, the baking, the warmth, would exist in the configuration they do if Felix's path to Stray Kids had gone any differently. And that path, as it turns out, was anything but straightforward. Number 1. Felix's journey to Stray Kids was unique. Most origin stories in K-pop follow a recognizable arc. A young person discovers a passion for performance, auditions at an entertainment company, enters a training system, and either makes it through or doesn't. The variables change, the company, the timeline, the degree of difficulty, but the basic structure is consistent enough that it functions almost as a genre template. Felix's story uses that template as a starting point and then diverges from it in ways that are specific enough, and verifiable enough, to make it genuinely worth telling in full. Because when you map out what he actually went through, not in the promotional version, but in the factual one, the outcome becomes significantly more impressive than it might appear at surface level. Felix was born in Sydney in 2000 and grew up there with no professional performance training and no industry connection to the Korean entertainment world. He wasn't a child who had been identified early and groomed toward an idol career. He was, by his own account in multiple interviews, a teenager who danced casually and enjoyed it without treating it as a serious vocational direction. When JYP Entertainment held open auditions in Sydney in 2017, part of the company's international scouting initiative, Felix attended. He was scouted on the basis of that audition. He was 16 years old. What followed was a relocation to Seoul that involved a language barrier that is worth taking seriously rather than glossing over. Felix's Korean at the point of his arrival was, by his own description, functional but far from fluent. He could communicate in Korean because of his family background, but the level required to navigate daily life as a JYP trainee, understanding instruction from choreographers, communicating with fellow trainees, following the rapid conversational Korean of group settings, was a different standard entirely. He has described in various interview contexts the experience of being in rooms where conversations moved faster than he could follow, where he sometimes missed nuances that affected how he understood situations and how others understood him. That's not a comfortable environment for a teenager who has also just left his entire established life behind on the other side of the world. JYP Entertainment's trainee system is one of the most structured and demanding in the South Korean entertainment industry. The company's founder, Park Jin-young, has been publicly vocal over many years about the training philosophy. It is comprehensive, rigorous, and explicitly designed to identify and eliminate weakness rather than simply develop strength. Trainees are evaluated across multiple competency areas: dance, vocal performance, stage presence, personality, team dynamics, and the evaluation is ongoing rather than limited to formal assessment periods. There is no guaranteed outcome. Trainees can be dropped at any stage. Many are. The survival rate within any given trainee cohort is low, and the pressure to perform consistently is present from the first week. Felix entered this system in 2017 with a language gap, no prior formal training, and a cultural context that differed from every other trainee around him. He was also arriving into the orbit of what would become the Stray Kids project, a concept that JYP was already developing at the time, which meant the timeline was compressed. He didn't have years of relatively lower stakes training to build up to the competitive environment. He entered close to the pressure zone almost immediately. The Stray Kids survival show aired in 2017 and early 2018, produced by NET and JYP Entertainment. 9 trainees competed across multiple performance missions, with eliminations determined by a combination of judge scores and audience voting. The format was transparent enough that viewers could track individual performance across episodes, who improved, who struggled, who maintained consistency under pressure, who didn't. Felix competed across the entirety of the show while simultaneously operating in a language that was not his first, in a performance framework that was new to him, alongside trainees who had in many cases been building their skills for years longer than he had. He made the final lineup. 8 members were selected from 9, with 1 elimination occurring during the final episode. Felix was among the 8 who debuted as Stray Kids in March 2018. That fact, stated plainly, is the outcome. But the process behind it, arriving from Sydney with limited Korean, no training history, no industry relationships, and making it through one of JYP's most competitive documented selection processes, is a trajectory that doesn't have many parallels in K-pop history. What's also worth noting is what happened in the years after debut. Felix didn't simply survive into the group. He developed into one of its most globally recognized members. His face became part of the visual identity of the group in magazine features, brand partnerships, and promotional materials. His voice became one of the group's sonic signatures. His English fluency became a functional asset in international engagements. His warmth became a central part of how the group's emotional identity was perceived by fans. None of those outcomes were guaranteed at the moment he stepped off a plane in Seoul as a 16-year-old who was still building his Korean vocabulary. The members of Stray Kids have spoken in various contexts about the early period and about what Felix was navigating. There's a recurring thread in those accounts that describes his determination as something visible and consistent rather than occasional, not dramatic declarations of resolve, but simply showing up and continuing to work regardless of how difficult the environment was. That's a particular kind of persistence that doesn't photograph well but matters more than almost anything else in a training context. His story also carries something that's harder to articulate but worth attempting. There's a version of Felix that didn't get on that plane. That stayed in Sydney, finished school, built a life that would have been perfectly fine by any ordinary measure. The version that did get on the plane, that navigated the language barrier, the cultural displacement, the grueling evaluations, the pressure of a survival show broadcast to millions, arrived somewhere that the other version never would have reached. Every time Felix performs, every time that voice enters a track, every time he hugs a member or hands someone something he baked, it's that second version showing up. The one who chose the harder road and walked it to the end. And that, more than any individual talent or trait, is what makes his story the most distinct thing about him, because it's the foundation underneath everything else you've heard today. Those are 7 facts about Felix, and taken together, they form a picture that's more coherent than it might first appear. A voice that stops people mid-scroll. A childhood spent on the other side of the world. An accent that traveled with him through every stage of a life that changed completely. A hobby that reveals what he reaches for when the industry noise quiets down. A face that contradicts everything people expect from a voice like his. A warmth that shows up consistently in the spaces where no one is watching particularly carefully. And a journey to get here that required more adaptation, more persistence, and more courage than most people will ever have to summon at 16 years old. None of these things exist in isolation. Each one feeds the others. The Australian upbringing explains the accent, shapes the warmth, and makes the journey harder and more meaningful at the same time. The voice makes every other contrast sharper. The baking and the caring and the gentle face all sit against the stage presence like a counterweight, not contradicting it, but completing it. What Felix demonstrates, across all of it, is that the things that make you different from the people around you are not liabilities to be managed. They are, if you carry them far enough and work hard enough, the exact things that make you irreplaceable. So here's the question worth leaving with, out of everything you just heard, the voice, the roots, the accent, the baking, the contrasts, the warmth, the journey, which one of those facts shifts the way you see Felix the most? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you want more deep dives like this one into the people behind the performances, you know what to do.